Today we're going to install an AMR500 Supercharger on the 719cc Kubota diesel engine in our lightweight Honda Insight. Wow! Once again, I strung together a bunch of words that have never been said before on the internet, and probably for a good reason. Let's take a moment and see how future Jimbo's doing on this project.
Yeehaw! That's boost, baby!
Okay, so now we know at least part of the story. Let's take a look at the basics of this supercharger experiment. Now, before we get started, I really want the audience to enjoy the content and try not to worry about too many things. Here's a few things you may need to keep in mind. This combination of parts has never been done before, and on our first attempt, we're trying to go with the simplest and most cost-efficient way of installing this AMR500 Supercharger. Our primary concern is, of course, how much boost this thing will generate. You know, I'd like to get about 8 to 10 psi of boost, but that all depends on the drive ratio of the supercharger. So let's take a quick detour and look at our previous supercharger project. As some of you folks may recall, a few years ago we installed an AMR500 supercharger on a fuel-injected 420cc single-cylinder 13-horsepower Harbor Freight engine. Now, the reason I bring this up is, on that build we ran the supercharger with a 1-to-1 drive ratio. You would think calculating the drive ratio would be simple. However, I polled the audience and asked the experts to calculate or guess the boost that we would generate with a 1-to-1 ratio. And, well, I didn't read all the comments, but for the most part, everybody got it wrong. And in case you're wondering, we made 8 psi of boost. Anyway, on this diesel experiment, we've had several people run the numbers already, and I really appreciate that. But at the end of the day, we really won't know the amount of boost this thing will generate until we actually give it a try. So that's the long and convoluted explanation of why we're choosing to keep the cost as low as possible on this experiment. And that's because, in all likelihood, we'll have to make changes to the system, and it doesn't make sense to dump a ton of money into this project while we're still in the prototype stage. Now, with that said, let's consider the scale of this project. And if you haven't noticed, everything is tiny. This ain't no Dirty Max diesel for a huge pickup truck. Nope. This engine was originally intended to run a compressor for a refrigerated semi-truck trailer. So it's important to remember that we can get away with stuff that most folks wouldn't do on a larger scale. And the last thing to remember is, this is an experiment. You know, every gearhead on the internet, including myself, wants to see what happens when you supercharge a 4-stroke diesel engine. Supercharged 2-stroke diesels were pretty common back in the day, and if I don't say this, someone will correct me, but on a 2-stroke diesel, the supercharger or blower was to help evacuate the combustion chamber and not necessarily to generate boost. Now, a turbocharger is clearly the way to go for forced induction. However, we've already tried turbocharging this engine when it was in the Saturn, and the results were lackluster. You see, once again, you have to remember the scale of this project. The VZ21 or RHB31 turbo that we used only generated boost when the engine was under a huge load. Now, under a light to medium load, we didn't get the boost we wanted. The turbo experiments on this engine were interesting, and we learned a thing or two. Anyway, now's the time to think outside the box and see if we can generate the boost off idle all the way up to 3600 RPM without any delays and without pushing the engine too hard. Oh yeah, I'm aware that this will affect the fuel economy. I think this car is currently getting over 70 miles to the US gallon, and that's cool. But as with all our projects, fuel economy is not the goal. It's an interesting data point, and sometimes we try to improve it, and sometimes we don't. Right now, we have the perfect opportunity to experiment with such a unique blend of parts that we've assembled in our project car. Now that everybody's on the same page, don't worry too much about stuff. This channel's all about experiments. So as you can see, we assembled the supercharger on the spare Kubota engine that Jason in Texas donated to the channel. The obvious reason we assembled this on the spare engine is to work out all the issues in mounting the supercharger to this little diesel engine. Keep in mind, we have a very limited space to work with, and this stuff needs to fit in the engine bay and allow the hood to close on the car. Now, the second reason we did this is so you folks can get a good look at all the parts. A lot of this stuff was custom fabricated, which is normally expensive to do, but since it was done in-house, it's cheap to do, as long as we don't get too carried away. Now, in a previous episode, we did test fit this basic package in the car, and it fits pretty good, but there are a few compromises. Now, unfortunately, once the supercharger's in the car, future Jimbo is telling me that you won't be able to see all these details. So now is a good time to soak it in if you're so inclined. I think probably the best way to show you folks what's going on is to strip this stuff off and to reassemble it on the dummy engine so I can explain the various aspects of how we got all this stuff to fit in such a tiny space. So here's just the engine with all the stuff removed. Now, planning for a project like this is a little bit less random than you may think. You see, this area over here is completely off limits, and that's because we're reserving this space so we can engineer a doohickey that can modify the fuel rack position to allow for more fuel under boost conditions. So basically all the space on this side of the engine has to be kept clear. Now on this side of the engine, we do have a reinforced hard point that we can use, but we have to share that mounting point with the alternator, and that's because alternators are good to have. So when we designed this system, we did have some options, but not many. Now this guy down here, of course, is the crank pulley, and this pulley is balanced to the engine, so we have to keep it exactly where it's at. Now, unfortunately, this pulley uses a very narrow belt, and the pulley is made for a 3L or a 3/8 belt, which is kind of small. But we do have a plan. Actually, several plans, because you always want a plan B. Now, due to the very limited space we have when this engine's in the car, we can't exactly stack another pulley on top of this one because there just isn't enough room. However, we can slip another pulley over this one, and that's an option. Of course, this would be more ideal, but it ain't gonna work. So there are other options, but I really need to take a trip to the salvage yard to have a look at what's available. You know, I do my best thinking at the junkyard because there's a huge selection of parts just waiting to be harvested. Anyway, I'm not too worried about this stuff because it'll definitely work for the time being. It turns out the only space we have for this supercharger when it's in the car is going to be on the lower front of the engine block. For the main mounting bracket, we're going to use this chunk of angle iron with some mounting points welded in for the supercharger. Now this bracket is also part of the front motor mount, so the size and length of this bracket is non-negotiable. This bracket has to be installed whether or not we install the supercharger. So even though this bracket is an awesome mounting point, it also gets in the way of the drive belts. But that's okay, we have provisions for that, and the solution is to redirect the drive belt with this idler bearing. Now, I showed this in a previous video, and a few viewers pointed out that the belt that I'm using will eventually be damaged by this bearing because it forces the belt to bend backwards. And I really appreciate the heads up. I think if we're lucky, this belt will last long enough so we can determine how much boost the supercharger is generating, and from that point we can source the correct size pulleys and finalize the design. So, no worries. The supercharger bolts to these pivot points and allows some adjustment. Basically, if possible, we want the supercharger to be more or less level when it's mounted in the car, and that'll make more sense later. This alternator mounting boss is also going to be used to anchor the supercharger with a couple of turnbuckles. Now we're going to be using 2 of these turnbuckles with some custom-made spacers. These turnbuckles are actually made for a sailboat rigging. I have no idea how that works on a boat, but for a supercharger they work great. Anyway, the pair of these stainless steel turnbuckles were less than $20 on the jungle site. The bolt I'm using will eventually be replaced with a grade 8, but for now this will work in the demo. And now we can zip this bolt in to hold the supercharger in position. Here's the other turnbuckle, and it fits right over here. Now we have to add another spacer for the alternator, like so, and then we can install the alternator. Well, everything is obviously loose, but I think you get the idea. Fast forward a bit and everything is tightened up and I have the drive belt installed. As you can see, we have this whoop-de-doo down here, and that may cause problems with the belt eventually. Now over here on the alternator, we have very little contact with the alternator pulley. You know, I'm not really happy with this, but future Jimbo says it works fine and the alternator belt doesn't slip. I still don't like it, but for now it'll be fine. I reckon we should install this supercharger in the car and see if there are any more surprises. Before we go ahead and install the supercharger in the car, I wanted to take a look at the condition of this unit. Allegedly, this is a used supercharger, but I can't help but think this thing is brand new. When I pulled the cover off, I discovered this guy was already filled with oil. Now, there doesn't seem to be a strong aroma of gear lube coming from this pool of oil, and that's interesting because the gear lube is what's recommended for these superchargers. Actually, that's what's recommended by the folks who sell them, but it's not necessarily what the supercharger needs. Now, a few years ago, I did a video on Supercharger oil, and we tried various oils in the fuel-injected 420cc supercharged intercooled
Big block.
Hemi Predator engine. Wow, I haven't said that in a while. Anyway, this Turbodyne oil seemed to work the best. However, when I made that video, I ordered this stuff, but it didn't arrive in time for the testing. Now, this stuff is what a lot of Volkswagen people use with their AMR500 supercharged Type 1 engines. So let's use this stuff. So YouTube is a great resource for learning stuff, and when I was researching this project, I discovered a video where someone had modified their AMR500 supercharger with some extra holes. Now, generally holes are bad, but sometimes they're good. The holes I'm talking about are for filling the supercharger with oil when it's mounted on the engine. You see, you can definitely drain the oil, no problem, but adding fresh oil is impossible unless the supercharger is removed from the engine. So, we're going to drill the case for 2 filling holes. One hole will be on the top of the supercharger, and the other hole will be on the side. The side hole allows the oil level to be checked. This is similar to how a manual transmission oil level is checked. Plus, we'll have a bonus hole on the top to fill the supercharger up. Over here will be the side hole, and over here will be the top hole. And over here is the drain hole, which is already provided by the supercharger manufacturer. The way I have this set up on the mill is a bit sketchy, and that's because in the real world, I write software and fiddle around with electronics. Some would say I have no business playing around with machine tools, but here I am despite all the odds. Now, I've already drilled a shallow center for alignment purposes, and before I punch through the case, I need to mill a flat so I'll have a good surface for the copper washer to set against. Now, this is not ideal, but the shop vac does come in handy to draw off any swarfs as I run the mill down into the case. Yeah, future Jimbo's real happy with this modification, in case anybody's wondering. Okay, that's enough drama for today. Let's take a look at the results. Well, not too shabby. It looks like it was always meant to be there. Unfortunately for the hole on the side of the case, I couldn't mill a flat because, well, the supercharger won't fit in the mill or the drill press when it's standing up. Anyway, that should give the keyboard warriors something to comment about. Now, I did flush the case with solvent in the event some debris got past the shop vac, so no worries. Let me zip the supercharger back together so we can fill it with oil. So the plan is to add oil to the supercharger until it starts spilling out the side over here, and that should be the perfect level. And there we go. I have a lot of confidence in this modification, but just in case, we're going to let the supercharger sit overnight on a clean paper cloth, and hopefully in the morning the cloth will still be clean. See you folks in a few seconds. Okay, it's been at least 12 hours. I've had my coffee. Let's see if the surgery was successful. Well, it's hard to say, but there's a tiny bit of oil on the bottom. However, the side bolt didn't leak a drop, so that's good. We'll keep an eye on this though. Now we're ready to install the supercharger. I'll snap my fingers and through the magic of video editing, it'll be in. And it's in. Everything fit perfectly in case you're wondering. And it looks like future Jimbo was right. You really can't see much of the details we talked about earlier, so hopefully you got an eyeful when you had a chance. So one of the compromises with this supercharger placement is it's relatively close to the exhaust downpipe, which is concerning. But here's a little bit of trivia. In its original application for the Japanese market, this AMR500 supercharger was installed on a 660cc Subaru Rex. And, as you can see, Subaru put the supercharger right next to the exhaust. I know, Subaru stuff is always questionable. So, I guess at some point we really ought to put a heat shield in there, but it'll be fine for now. Now, the good news is the exhaust on this car doesn't get really hot, and that's because diesel. And the other good news is we put the supercharger directly in the airflow, so it's always getting a nice blast of air when the car is moving. At this point, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't start the engine and see if the drive belt works and if the supercharger even spins. Stand by. So far, so good. Oh hell yeah, the supercharger's pumping a huge amount of air. Wow, I guess I wasn't expecting it to work this good. Well, that's good news. The bad news is I had to drain the radiator to install the supercharger, so now we gotta take the car outside and bleed the cooling system. Oh yeah, we got another one of these cars. This one is normal, and everything works including the IMA. We'll post an update video in the near future. Anyway, on this car, bleeding the cooling system was made a lot easier by installing a fill port so we can directly fill the engine block with coolant. It still takes about 15 minutes to get all the air bubbles out, but at least now we don't have to jack the car up. Okay, fast forward a few hours, and the cooling system's purged of all the air, and we went ahead and connected all the induction and boost pipes. Now, the boost pipe goes directly from the supercharger to the intake manifold, and for this go-around, we didn't plumb in an intercooler, but we do have one. The skinny and somewhat fragile fan belt is still holding up fine, so that's good news. And we even added an air filter to the system, so we're good to go for the first start. It'll be interesting to see how much boost we get from this contraption. You guys ready? Stand by for ignition. Wow, the sound of the supercharger changed dramatically, and it feels like it's generating a ton of boost at idle. Let's put a gauge on this thing. Okay, the boost gauge is installed and it's reading pressure at the manifold. Anyone want to guess how much boost we're making at idle? Perhaps pause the video and place your guess. Okay, here we go. Well, it's hard to say, but it looks like it's making 6 psi of boost. I have to say, that's more than I expected. A lot more. I wonder why the needle's bouncing. Let me goose the engine a little bit and we can see where the boost goes. Well, we're hitting 10 psi pretty much instantly. I reckon it would go a lot higher with some more revs. You turbo guys jealous? Yeah, I know you are. Anyway, the needle stops bouncing when the revs go up, so maybe it's an idle thing when the supercharger's spinning slower. This is an interesting development. So at this point, we're running a slight overdrive on the supercharger. It seems like a 1-to-1 or a slightly underdrive ratio would have gotten us to the target boost we were aiming at. This is fascinating. Hey, let me shut the engine off so we can talk through this. Now, for practical purposes, I think 6 psi of boost at idle seems a bit much. So I had a feeling something like this would happen, and off camera I put together a 12-volt dump valve, but I don't think this valve is going to be big enough. I reckon so far we're doing pretty good. We have way more boost than we wanted, and we have no way to control it. It's time to do some thinking. In the meantime, I would like to hear from the experts, if there are any. What would be the next step? So here's a word of caution for the folks who want to chime in. This is a diesel engine and not a gasoline engine. Diesels don't have a conventional throttle, and the speed of the engine is regulated by how much fuel is injected. Of course, without a conventional throttle, diesels don't generate vacuum. The AMR500 is a Roots-type positive displacement supercharger, and aside from generating boost, it doesn't behave anything like a turbocharger. And finally, whatever we do, it's going to be inexpensive. You know, I have a few ideas that I'd like to try, so no worries, but I would like to see what the experts have to say. Now, keep in mind, I may seem like an idiot, but I was able to build and tune a fuel-injected supercharged single-cylinder 420cc Harbor Freight engine. Well, to be fair, actually only an idiot would do that, but you get the idea. I would love to take the car out and blast it down our makeshift drag strip, but perhaps that's not a good idea right now. So I'll look forward to hearing from the best of the best in the audience. I love to read the comments, and perhaps someone out there will share their knowledge with us. So I think it's time to say farewell for now, until next time.